I'm Luis da Silva. I'm the Executive Director of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative, and I'm also the Bradley Professor of Cybersecurity at Virginia Tech. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to this, which is the third webinar in our CCI Cyber Leadership Series. If you haven't heard of CCI, our mission is research with economic impact at the intersection of security, autonomous systems, and data. We're about 320 researchers from across Virginia, and we receive core funding from the Commonwealth of Virginia. So these areas of focus of CCI, cybersecurity, autonomy, artificial intelligence, affect basically every area of the economy. And what we're seeing now is that the COVID-19 crisis is accelerating the adoption of technology across the board. And then with that is also opening up some new challenges in cybersecurity, in how we use AI responsibly, and so on. So we're devoting this series of webinars to discussing some of the research and workforce development that CCI is involved in that's particularly relevant to the current moment of COVID-19. We are going to keep the discussion at the non-expert level. So this is really meant for a general audience. And we'll take a few questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the Q&A box, and we'll have some time at the very end. This should take about 15 to 20 minutes. So today's topic is cyber innovation in the law in a rapidly changing world. And I'm really delighted to have two real experts in this area joining me today. So Professor Fred Lederer and Professor Iria Giuffrida. Professor Lederer is the Chancellor Professor of Law at William & Mary University. Fred has a Juris Doctor degree from Columbia and an LLM from UVA. He's also the founder and the director of the Center for Legal and Court Technology. He has a wealth of experience. He is a former defense attorney. He's a former prosecutor, trial judge, and a law reform expert. Professor Giuffrida is a professor of the practice of law, also at William & Mary University. Iria holds a PhD from Queen Mary, University of London, and an LLM from William & Mary. She's admitted to practice in the state of New York. She's a solicitor in England and Wales, and she also qualified as a solicitor in the Republic of Ireland, where I used to live until recently. So prior to practicing law, Iria also taught law in the US and in the UK, and she worked for the European Ombudsman in Brussels. So Fred and Iria, I'm really delighted to have you both here for this webinar to talk about the role of technology, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence in the legal system. And I'm going to start with you, Fred. I introduced you a few minutes ago as the director of the Center for Legal and Court Technology at William & Mary. So I'd like to ask you to say a few words about the mission and the main activities of the center.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's our pleasure to do so. So the mission of the Center for Legal and Court Technology, better known as CLCT to many, is very simple and straightforward: to improve the administration of justice around the world through the use of appropriate technology. And the key word has always been appropriate. That's been our mission statement since we were formally founded in 1993, but it's changed a bit over the years. Originally, we spent most of our effort on how to use technology to improve dispute resolution, particularly working in the fields of courtroom and hearing room technology. A matter, I might add, has suddenly reappeared with a vengeance with the pandemic. But then 3 years ago, approximately, thanks to funding from Cisco Systems and the extraordinary, unique opportunity to entice my colleague, Professor Iria Giuffrida from London, we have expanded into the legal issues related to artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, all the other technologies, what we call the AI ecosystem.
And Fred, I understand that one of the assets that you have is the McLaughlin courtroom, which is located in the William & Mary Law School, and which is the world's most technologically advanced courtroom. Can you give us some details and walk us through what the courtroom offers?
Absolutely. I think we have some pictures that we can use to illustrate this. So the McLaughlin, if we go full screen on that, thank you. The McLaughlin courtroom is quite literally the world's most technologically advanced trial and appellate courtroom, and it changes on a continuing basis. This is a roughly 10-year-old picture from what we call a laboratory trial, an experimental case. There's a federal district judge on the bench. You're looking at a remote witness testifying, and each of our jurors is looking at documents that the witness is testifying about. We have a court reporter who's publishing to the internet a word-for-word court transcript, and we're using technology to present evidence. If we go on to the next picture, you can see some of the work we've been doing in the area of remote appearances, matters that are now critically important in the age of the pandemic. On the left, you see what was, as far as we know, the world's first use of video technology for a remote juror, a matter that has in fact been done in a real trial in the Southern District of New York approximately 3 weeks ago. On the right, you see experimental work with remote interpreters. If we go on to the next picture, this is a remote appeal. You're looking at the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and there are 3 different judges, each appearing from an entirely different courthouse, each using, at that point, a laptop computer, while our student staff member is arguing an appeal taken from an actual case that had been done a year before. If we go on to our last picture, this is a piece of evidence we used a year ago in an experimental case that we tried for the United States Navy. Here, you're looking at cell phone video evidence, which is increasingly a major part of the case presentation for many different types of cases throughout the legal system. So that's what our courtroom does in microcosm.
And I understand that using this asset and the other assets of the center, you can claim some world firsts in the legal area. I think you already mentioned one of them, but can you tell us about some of the other world firsts that you were involved in?
Indeed, eventually it sounds rather boring. We are, as far as we were the first known court to use holographic evidence, 3D evidence, arguably the first use of virtual reality evidence, and a year ago in the trial that I mentioned, the world's first use of an artificial intelligence related open microphone, automated speech to text court transcript. A long sentence.
That's great. And focusing on the pandemic, what area of all of this work that you all do is potentially most important as we cope with the new world that is ahead during and after the pandemic?
Given the need for social distancing, the courts have originally largely closed down, though many are now reopening. And the big question is the degree to which we can have virtual and potentially virtual trials, up to the possibility of a virtual criminal jury, which is a rather difficult matter to do. So we've been hard at work in this field. Approximately weeks ago, we tried an experimental bench trial with the help of one of our students and our staff. And we are in discussions with courts around the United States and occasionally in other countries as well.
And if I could tag along a comment to what Fred is saying, in the legal field, sort of legal sphere, there's different ways in which disputes get resolved. Of course, Fred is talking about disputes in court, but COVID and the pandemic has also affected how alternative means of resolving disputes, of which mediation and arbitration tend to be the more common. And so just like courts have had to cope with the challenge, different countries have coped with it in different ways, with the challenge of potentially shifting some of the hearing in a sort of virtual environment. Mediation and arbitrations have had to cope with the same sort of reality. So there's a lot more, there's a much thicker web of real challenges the lawyer having to cope with, whether or not the dispute is in court.
And thank you, Iria. And my next question is actually for you as well. So I know that you've been really involved in research as well as teaching about artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, and other new technologies, including cybersecurity. And to me as an engineer, it's really fascinating to think of lawyers being trained to actually understand the technology. I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about both the research and the teaching aspects of that.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, because this allows me to link up to something that Fred mentioned a little while ago. CLCT's sort of domain and expertise has recently expanded thanks to a grant that we received by Cisco, who's asked us, really has asked Fred in the first instance, I sort of tag along, has asked us to think about what are the likely legal issues that are going to arise from this increasing common use of technology? And the reason why this is an important question is because, and this is a story that Fred tells a lot better, so I'm going to just give it a go in my way. Lawyers are known for not being technically minded, and of course there are exceptions. So this is a brutal generalization, so I hope that none of your listeners are going to take personal offense. But the slightly more troubling aspect of us not being technically minded is that we're almost proud of not being technically minded. Now, in a different reality, this might have been a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke, but in the world that we are inhabiting and the kind of law students that Fred and I, as well as any other law schools in the state and across the nation, is training, reality is much more complex. So we are thrilled to be able to help the next generation lawyers to think about some of these issues, but we're also worrying and trying to support the existing generation of lawyers. And by lawyers, I really do mean anybody working in the legal field. So starting with judges, practitioners, but also lawyers that work inside corporations, what we normally call in the field in-house lawyers. So the work that we have done is sort of these different strands at the level of the junior lawyers, so the law students. Because of the grant, with the support of the grant, we've created a course that really tries to give an overview of what these legal issues are likely to be. And the very first objective of the course is to train students to think about what the right question is. And some answers are available, some answers are not going to be here, and perhaps we hope our law students will be part of the discourse to framing those answers. But as I said, at the same time, we're worrying about the current practitioners out there. So we have prepared and delivered sometimes short lectures, other times sort of longer kind of programs, to try to engage in a non-threatening sort of approach and trying to bring our colleagues along with thinking and opening a discourse. And we've also sort of tried to create slightly more fun activities, such as writing competitions. And we've just announced the results of a third writing competitions that is really open to law students worldwide. We were quite pleased this year to have results, sort of some of the winners come from American law schools. One of the special mentions is a young law students in India. So we're really trying to bring on board the profession from across the globe. And one last thing to mention, which I think is part of the theme that we're going to develop now, is the importance of interdisciplinary approaches. Lawyers, just like you said, you're quite surprised the lawyers might be interested in this topic. So we really have to, because the real problems happen in the physical world. And I just, as a lawyer, cannot solve them. I really need to build ties and understanding with engineers, with computer scientists, but also with other professions. And so we've developed, this year is the first year, an interdisciplinary cybersecurity course that Fred and I co-teach with a colleague from the business school and a colleague from computer science. So this year was the pilot year, and of course, COVID struck in between. So any sort of challenges, but it's been a fantastic experience, and we're going to learn a lot from this year to keep developing in the coming years.
And if I could add 2 points quickly. One, we spend a fair amount of time also attempting to educate judges in particular. And I think that's been reasonably successful. Additionally, we are fortunate enough to be part of a fairly major international research project run out of the University of Montreal. Our part of it includes, among other things, for instance, AI-based decision-making tools for legal professionals. which raises technology, legal, and rather fundamental ethical issues as well.
Yeah, and I certainly think this is a two-way street, right? So engineers also increasingly need to be aware, engineers and computer scientists and others need to be aware of the public policy and legal implications of some of the technology that we develop. And I think that's more and more true with questions around privacy, dissemination of information, and so on. So in CCI, certainly very interested in this multidisciplinary approach, joining lawyers, technologists, psychologists, and so on, to look into some of these problems. So I have a last question for you both. What do you see your agenda moving forward to be like? And do you see a lasting impact of the current crisis on how technology is adopted in courtrooms?
In the short term, the answer is clearly yes. The need to handle matters remotely, just as many of us have been teaching now since the beginning of the pandemic remotely, is changing the legal system, at least in the US, and I believe fairly in many other countries as well. I'm fairly confident that elements of this will remain with us long after we hopefully have coped adequately with the virus. It's very hard to explain to a hardworking person why that person should take a day off from work to appear for a 15-minute traffic court hearing when we could do it just as we're doing right now. The greater question is the impact, particularly on lawyers and judges and law students, of relying on technology during the pandemic. I cautiously hope that it will change our perspective, and that, to paraphrase what Iria said a few moments ago, we won't be quite so proud of our occasional ignorance. But I'll leave further comment to Iria.
And I think maybe I'll take a more sort of systemic view. Certainly the pandemic has accelerated, in one sense, my appreciation for the work and the objectives of CCI. As you mentioned, Louise, the CCI is not here just to support the technical aspect and development, which of course it is, but also to educate the next generation of cyber experts. And those cyber experts will be working across industries. So the thing that is a personal takeaway point from this experience has been the possibility and the opportunity of meeting experts from other fields. We work in the coastal node, acronymed COVA, and the leading institution in our node is ODU, and so the opportunity of meeting professors there as well as the other professors in the region, and thinking together about what cyber really means, because we all come from different disciplines, and so we give different meanings to those words. And the opportunity of also learning from students, and I'd really go across from undergrad students all the way to graduate students, how they perceive the societal needs for thinking about cyber challenges, and how those are not just challenges for a particular group. So this is the IT team problem. I think that our lawyers are starting to understand that, and our students, it isn't an IT problem. If you're a lawyer, you need to understand what the issue is, and you need to support the business or support your client in facing and managing the issue. So the crisis has given me greater inspiration and momentum in thinking about, you know, a cyber challenge is crisis management as well as many other things. So how do we together work and try to develop good practices?
And thank you again for giving us some insight into all this work that you do in the context of CCI and in the context of technology in the legal world. I will stop asking questions, but if there are any questions from the audience, Brianna can let us know.
Yes, it looks like we have a couple of questions. The first one is, what are the security and privacy considerations around a technology-based courtroom, especially for remote access? Are there standards or regulations, and what are the threats?
If I might, there are no per se standards. The question of threats is an interesting question. Prior to the pandemic, there was an easy, inadequate answer. That was Trials in the United States, hearings in the US are, with very rare exceptions, public. Therefore, we were not particularly concerned about the idea of someone, for instance, being able to view the proceedings who was uninvited. Now, of course, we've had Zoom bombing, which is certainly not a way to encourage the fair administration of justice. And of course, there has always been, from the beginning of the use of computers, the possibility of fundamental computer security issues, malware implantation, and related matters. Courts are just like any other major part of society. They are potentially vulnerable, and we have been doing our best to communicate that to the court administrators and judges when we have an opportunity.
And if I can take the international ADR perspective, contrary to court proceedings, as Fred said, are public. Mediation and arbitration, I'm just going to be talking about these two, are by their own nature confidential and private. So the concerns of having a remote arbitral hearing, which may be subject to uninvited attendance, is something that is really troubling practitioners. And what I can say is, although you're right, or rather, just like in the court context, in arbitration, there really isn't a hard guidelines. Practitioners are working quite extensively to try to develop something. There is a sole protocol which offers some guidance, and the various arbitration centers across the globe are trying to develop their own in-house guidance to make sure that these remote, whether they're hearings or mediation sessions, remain as protected from a cyber perspective as possible.
I might add one other point. We don't have the technical expertise, Iri or I, or most of our staff. One of our two staff members actually do have the technical expertise to address elements of this. But most people are aware that Zoom was soundly criticized for having massive cybersecurity problems. So one of the questions that we didn't used to worry about is there a possibility of using a video conferencing product, and that is an entry into your data, your passwords, and everything else. Commercial level video conferencing in high-end units usually has been immune, as far as I know, to that. But the now use of software video conferencing solutions, codecs as we call them, have opened the door to other risks. And those are risks that I think our companies have recognized and either have addressed or in the process of addressing them now.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more questions if we have time. The first is, what guidance might you suggest on advising industry and the public of cybersecurity threats?
Iri, do you have any comment?
Yes, well, giving guidance, I think, is probably our objective to some extent of the work that we're trying to do, but we are at the stage of trying to explain to people what we mean by it. I think the cyber hygiene, which is a word that is being used in various contexts, makes sense to those like us, as sort of to a self-referential audience. We know what it is, we listen, we change the passwords, etc. Teaching these objectives to the busy public who have to cope with the pandemic, have got children, have got cats who are unwell, etc., it's a bit of a challenge. And so we're trying to work together to find ways to pass on the message of at least basic cyber hygiene to the next generation of cyber specialists across disciplines, and hoping that that has a sort of an exponential effect. But it's a very good question. It's a difficult one to answer.
I would just briefly add that a lot of the threats and vulnerabilities occur through fairly basic, simple attacks, like phishing attacks, right? So where we need to actually make everyone aware of those sorts of vulnerabilities. So there is an outreach mission in CCI where we engage with the broader public, and we engage with high school teachers and with the communities and so on, to try to bring some of these basic notions of cyber hygiene, as Iria mentioned.
One of our CCI projects is the production of curriculum materials for local governments, such as county governments, as well as small and medium-sized businesses. And the fundamental requirement for all of this is first and foremost to get everyone's attention and make sure that they recognize that there are, in fact, risks out there. And many of those risks, as Lisa just mentioned, can be rather readily addressed.
Great. We have one last question. Which research areas related to artificial intelligence, such as natural language processing, that you consider more important or relevant for the legal field?
I'm going to guess that we may well disagree with each other. The argument, I mean, in terms of the application, the single largest application of AI in the legal system at the moment is the same as non-legal, which is natural language processing, I think. The issue that is most troublesome, other than error, bias, and all the rest of that, a little minor things that are very much non-minor, is the potential use of AI tools to help or to make decisions. And the preliminary products the products that are now being used are clearly troubling in terms of how they've been used and their implications. And that's a matter at least I am particularly concerned about.
Yes, and I think I completely agree with Fred. The side of the concern that sort of keeps me awake at night is the fact that these systems are being used to, at this stage in the legal field, we're not talking necessarily about actual decision making. These are systems to support human decision making. But the human who receives the output of the system, I don't think a person really understands how the system operates. And I don't mean understanding from the technical perspective of how the algorithm came out with the answer, but in terms of what kind of thought process goes behind it. And so I find it a little unsettling, the fact that a decision maker, which in the legal field could very easily be a judge, could be nudged towards a kind of decision. There are particular tools out there that do sentiment analysis of judgments, which means that they go through a huge volume of judgments and suggests which words a judge is more likely to respond to. Now, there's nothing wrong in the sense that lawyers have always done this, okay? So I'm not trying to suggest that this is something that is devastating the legal system. We've always had to read previous decisions, and we are conscious of what kind of broad arguments some judges are more responsive to. It's just the degree of granularity that AI and natural language processing brings to the table without the equivalent degree of understanding on the other side that I find somewhat difficult to accept without a thoughtful discourse with those human beings who will be making decisions.
The most basic problem that I've seen is a variant of what Iria just said. It is a total lack of understanding of what AI is and its advantages and its disadvantages. As a result, people are prepared to take things for granted that they should be questioning to a great degree.
And we, this is actually an area of emphasis for CCI in trustworthy AI or AI assurance, right? So making sure that the decisions that are reached by AI algorithms don't embed biases that may be present in the data, as well as explainable AI. So trying to understand what process actually the algorithm has gone through to reach a certain decision or recommendation. It's a huge field and really very important as AI is embedded in more and more of our day-to-day decisions. But I'm afraid I can hear the bell, so we're out of time. Thank you so much again, Iria and Fred, and to all our attendees. Thank you for joining us. If you're interested in further seminars, if you go to our webpage and subscribe to updates, we'll keep you informed of any further webinars that we run. So thank you all again, stay safe, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.